Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today we're doing something a little dangerous.
It's a little dangerous. Yeah, I'm the resident researcher here, and I'd say very dangerous, honestly.
Right, because we are looking at the man who essentially, wrote the source code for the Muslim mind.
Imam Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i.
The architect of Islamic law. And I say dangerous because the stack of research you sent over for us to unpack today, I mean, it is intense.
It's massive.
Yeah. We've got his biography, which reads like a political thriller. We have
Alam. Book.
Exactly, his giant legal encyclopedia. And then we have this highly debated list of 100 critical and taboo questions that touches on, well, everything.
Everything from the death penalty to how we even know history is real.
Right.
But it's necessary. You really can't understand the Middle East or Islamic history as a whole without understanding the Shafi'i architecture.
So the core tension here as we get into this deep dive,
Yeah.
it seems to be about authority. Because before this guy, everyone was kind of just doing their own thing. And he steps in and says, no, we need a standardized system. We need a rule of law.
And that's the ultimate conflict of his legacy. Did that system save the civilization by creating consistency? Or did it inadvertently, did it lock the Muslim mind?
Freeze the culture in the 9th century.
Right. It's the classic tension between stability and stagnation. Did he build a foundation, or did he build a ceiling that no one could ever rise above?
Well, let's start with the man himself, because his actual life story plays a huge role in how he viewed the world. He wasn't just sitting in an ivory tower theorizing.
Far from it. Born in 767 CE in Gaza, which is significant, but he was raised in deep, deep poverty in Mecca.
And that poverty is key, right? Because it meant he didn't have the luxury of just inheriting his status.
Exactly. He had to hustle for knowledge. He was an outsider looking in.
And he enters the scene during what the sources describe as an intellectual civil war, which I love that phrase.
It's very accurate.
It wasn't just guys politely arguing in a library. There were two distinct camps fighting for the soul of the law.
You have to imagine the Islamic world at this time is expanding rapidly. It's huge, Spain to India. And you have these two power centers with very different vibes.
Right.
In Medina, you had the Hadith, the traditionalists.
This is where Shafi'i's first teacher was based, Imam Malik.
Yes. And their whole thing was the living tradition.
So basically, this is how we've always done it here in the Prophet City.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Communal memory. If the people of Medina do it, it must be right. Think of it as the village model. Everyone knows everyone, so you trust the crowd.
But then you have Baghdad.
The big city. The New York City of the 8th century. Cosmopolitan, diverse, full of Greek philosophy and Persian bureaucracy.
And there you have the al-Ray,
The rationalists.
the logic guys.
Or the elitist judges, if you want to be uncharitable. They argued that your village tradition in Medina doesn't help us figure out, say, tax law for a silk merchant from China. We need to use logic, reason, Ray.
So Shafi studies under Malik in Medina, soaking up all that tradition. But then he goes to Baghdad.
Yep, and he studies under al-Shaybani, who is the top rationalist student.
So he's double majoring in two opposing schools of thought that basically hate each other.
Precisely. And his genius, what we call the Shafi synthesis, was realizing that both sides had a fatal flaw.
How so?
Well, the rationalists were too subjective. If law is based on human reason, whose reason? Yours, mine, the caliphs. It becomes totally arbitrary.
But the traditionalists in Medina had a problem too.
Right, their reliance on communal memory was drifting. Shafi'i argued that memory fades. Culture changes. You can't just say, we do this because we've always done this. You need an objective standard.
And that standard became revelation.
Yes.
But not just the Quran.
The Sunnah,
Yeah.
the example of the Prophet. But, and this is the crucial part, not just what people vaguely remember, but verified, documented reports. He argued that human reason has to be secondary to authentic revelation.
Now, here's where it gets really fascinating to me as we look at the sources. We often think of these historical religious figures as having these stone tablet, unchanging opinions. But al-Shafi'i has this massive plot twist in his own life.
The old school versus the new school?
Yeah. It's an incredible example of intellectual humility.
It really is. So he develops his old school thought in Baghdad, but then around 813 CE, he moves to Egypt. And when he gets to Egypt, he encounters new data.
Different social reality.
Different customs. He hears different hadiths he hadn't had access to before.
And he doesn't just stubbornly double down on his old work.
No, he essentially cancels his previous rulings. He rewrites his legal theory into the new school, Madhab al-Jadid.
The sources mention specific examples of this, like his rulings on prayer times.
Changing based on the geography and light in Egypt versus Iraq.
Or his rules on evidence, which really challenges the idea that this law was meant to be static. I mean, if the architect himself changed his blueprints when the environment changed, that says something.
It implies that while the methodology was strict, the actual application was meant to be responsive to reality.
Okay, let's unpack that methodology, because this gets us into the whole science versus invention debate. The problem Shafi'i faces is, how do you actually know what the Prophet said 200 years later?
Right. 2 centuries have passed. The telephone game is in full effect.
And this is where he insists on the isnad, the chain of transmission. Reading through this part, it struck me as almost scientific.
Very much so.
He's acting like a modern historian, like a data scientist 1,000 years early.
He is the first data scientist of Islam. He looks at the chaos and says, look, I don't care if you're a genius judge in Baghdad or a pious elder in Medina. If you claim the Prophet said X, show me the receipts.
I heard from A, who heard from B, who heard from C, who heard from the Prophet.
A biographical receipt. He effectively created a blockchain of authentication, and if person B in that chain was known to be a liar or had a bad memory,
the whole data point gets thrown out.
Exactly. He wanted the golden chain. The gold standard was Shafi to Malik to Nafi to Ibn Umar.
But this is also where the skeptics enter the chat. The sources bring up Joseph Schacht, the Western academic from the mid-20th century, and his critique is pretty damaging if it's true.
Yes, the Schachtun critique.
He basically accuses Shafi'i of accidental forgery.
It's the back projection theory. Schacht asks, did al-Shafi'i discover these chains, or did his strict demand for chains encourage people to just invent them?
Basically, if I'm in an argument with you in the 9th century, and I know I can't win the argument unless I have a direct quote from the Prophet, am I tempted to just fabricate a chain?
Schacht argues that legal debates of the 8th and 9th centuries were projected backward onto the Prophet to give them unassailable authority. So a ruling about property law in Baghdad suddenly gets a fake chain attached to it to make it look like it came from 7th century Medina.
It sounds like retconning in a movie. You know, oh yeah, that character was totally there the whole time.
Retroactive continuity, exactly.
Yeah. But wait, that sounds like a massive conspiracy? You're telling me thousands of people across 3 continents coordinated a lie?
And that is exactly the counter-argument from scholars like Azami. They argue the math simply doesn't work. To fake a chain that could actually pass Shafi'i's intense filter, you'd need hundreds of conspirators who had never even met each other to tell the exact same story.
Right.
Azami argues Shafi'i didn't invent the chain. He acted as a strict auditor. The chains already existed, but they were messy, people were sloppy. Shafi'i came in and said, if the chain isn't perfect, we reject it. He was a filter, not a fabricator.
So it's the difference between creating the data and cleaning the data.
And Shafi'i was a ruthless cleaner.
Let's pivot slightly to the taboo questions from our source list, because this touches on that telephone game concept again. There's a prominent critique from ex-Muslim and atheist spaces regarding oral transmission.
The argument is pretty straightforward. How can a report passed through 5 or 6 people over 150 years be legally binding when we know human memory is inherently flawed?
Even if everyone is totally honest, people just misremember things.
Right.
And the sources mention the silent gap. What is that exactly?
The silent gap refers to the fact that many hadiths appear in Shafi'i's al-Umm that are completely missing from earlier books, like Malik's Muwatta. So the skeptics ask, if these sayings were so foundational, why didn't the earlier guys know them? Did they just appear out of nowhere?
Which leads right into the single report dilemma, the Kabar al-Wahid. This seems to be the major epistemic crisis of his time.
It really was. Shafi'i argued that a report from a single reliable person, just one guy, is binding law.
And the rationalists absolutely screamed about this.
Oh, they hated it. The Mu'tazila, the rationalists, they said, wait a minute. How can one person's word override general Quranic principles? What if he's just mistaken? What if he's lying?
Especially on life and death issues, like stoning or warfare. You're gonna base that on one guy's memory?
Exactly. But Shafi'i's logic here is really interesting. He used a courtroom analogy. He said, in a court of law, if a witness is upright, if they have adl, reliability, we accept their testimony to decide the fate of a person.
Right.
So he argued, to reject the single report is to reject the fundamental way humans establish history itself.
Because if you don't trust one reliable guy, you can't trust anything you haven't physically seen with your own eyes.
Precisely. He felt that rejecting the single report was a slippery slope to rejecting all recorded history.
There's another major critique in the sources, specifically from the Shia perspective, and this one is about who Shafi'i trusted in those chains.
Right, the sectarian critique. The Shia view is that Shafi'i relied heavily on companions who actually fought against Ali, but he bypassed the imams of the Al-Bayt.
The Prophet's own family.
Yes. They essentially ask, why go to the neighbors for news about the house when you can just ask the family who lives there?
But Shafi'i has this very famous poetry defense for this, doesn't he? If loving the family of Muhammad is Rafidism,
let mankind and jinn bear witness, I am a Rafidi. It's a very powerful line.
and the sources are split on how to interpret that.
Very split. Some say it was genuine, deep devotion. Others say it was political cover. He was walking a very dangerous political tightrope, trying to respect the Prophet's family without endorsing the Shia political claims against the caliphs of his time.
Speaking of tightropes, we have to talk about the actual content of Alum. The sources have a literal content warning section for a reason, because there are rulings in here that clash violently with modern human rights standards.
This is where modern apologetics meets the old texts, and we have to be impartial and honest about the sources. Shafi'i codified these things.
Let's take apostasy. Ridda, the death penalty for leaving the faith. The modern critique is obvious. The Quran explicitly says no compulsion in religion.
Right. And yet Shafi'i codifies the death penalty for it. The historical context the defenders offer is that in the 9th century, religion wasn't just a personal, private belief. It was your citizenship.
Your political allegiance.
Exactly. So apostasy wasn't viewed as simply changing your mind about God. It was viewed as literal treason against the state, often during wartime.
So the defense argument is that he was punishing treason, not free thought.
That is the defense, though critics quickly point out that distinction gets completely lost in how it was actually applied over the centuries.
Then there is the marriage of minors.
This is a tough one for modern readers. Alum permits it. The defense here often relies on urf, custom.
So they argue that maturity was defined biologically and socially very differently back in the 9th century.
Yes, and this is a really key point for modern Shafi'i scholars. They argue that Shafi'i's own system actually allows for this to change.
Because of qiyas.
Exactly,
Okay.
analogy. If the medical and social understanding of maturity changes, then the ruling should change to reflect that reality.
So they're using his own methodology to update his rulings.
They argue you can keep the method, the operating system, but you can discard the specific 9th century ruling. The old app, so to speak.
And finally, slavery. Alum codifies it. It regulates it.
It does, and the primary critique is, why didn't he just abolish it? Why didn't he use his massive intellectual influence to say, this practice is fundamentally wrong?
And the defense outlined in the sources.
It highlights the tension between civil law and religious ethics. In religious law, the slave is a human, equal to the master in prayer and before God. But in civil law, they were treated as property, an economic asset.
So Shafi'i was regulating the economic system that already existed.
Right. He wasn't a social revolutionary in that specific sense. He was a jurist trying to bring strict legal order to an existing chaotic society.
Bringing order to chaos really seems to be the defining theme of his life. Which brings us to his legacy. The sources mention this very famous phrase, the closing of the gates of Ijtihad.
Independent reasoning.
Right. Did Shafi'i's system actually stop people from thinking for themselves?
This is the major historical debate. The critics absolutely say yes. By prioritizing the report the Hadith over human reason, the legal system became rigid.
Because if you encounter a totally new problem today, like modern global economics or cloning, and you can't find an ancient Hadith about it, you're stuck.
You're stuck trying to force fit an ancient text onto a modern problem. Critics argue it creates this golden age complex where the past is always viewed as inherently better than the present.
But the defenders, like Halak mentioned in the text, they have a very different take on this.
Halak's argument is brilliant. He argues that Shafi'i actually saved Islam from total anarchy. You have to remember, without a constitution, which is essentially what became, the caliphs could have just invented whatever laws they wanted.
Just, I'm the caliph, so I say this is illegal now.
Exactly. Shafi'i put a massive check on state power. He said, no, even you, Mr. Caliph, have to follow the text.
And that standardization allowed civil society to actually function. I mean, the sources note that a contract written in Spain meant the exact same thing as a contract in Baghdad because they were using the same legal language, Shafi'i's language.
It allowed trade to flourish. It created a unified civilization.
So, did he lock the mind, or did he save the civilization?
It's the paradox of success. Shafi'i built such a robust, logical, frankly brilliant system that later generations kind of got lazy.
They stopped doing the hard work.
They stopped doing the hard work of verifying and rethinking because Shafi'i had already done it so well.
So, the closing of the gates of Hadith, it wasn't that the door was locked, it's that nobody wanted to walk through it anymore.
That is a perfect way to put it.
And it seems like Shafi'i himself wasn't anywhere near as rigid as his followers eventually became. I mean, we talked about it earlier. The guy changed his entire school of thought just because he moved to Egypt.
That is the ultimate irony of his life. The man who founded the strict system was completely willing to rewrite it when he saw new evidence. But later generations froze his new school and treated it as the final untouchable word.
Instead of doing what he did, which was to look at the actual reality in front of him.
Exactly.
So if we synthesize all of this for the listener, the sources refer to him as a critical traditionalist.
I think that label fits him best. He wasn't a blind follower. He fully rejected the living tradition of Medina when it couldn't provide documented proof.
But he wasn't a pure rationalist either.
No, he didn't trust human reason alone to define ultimate morality. He was a systematizer. He wanted a verifiable, objective standard.
You wanted the receipts.
They wanted the receipts.
And in doing so, he built the framework that held an entire civilization together for over 1,000 years. But, as we've seen with the taboo questions we discussed, that framework has come under immense pressure in the modern world.
It has. And the challenge for modern followers is figuring out, do they follow Shafi'i's specific 9th century rulings? Or do they follow Shafi'i's method of constantly reevaluating the law based on new contexts?
So here's a thought to leave you with as we wrap up this deep dive. We live in a world today of fake news and total information chaos. Shafi'i spent his entire life trying to build a reliable filter for the truth. He built a cage of strict methodology to protect the text. But the question for the modern world is, have we been sitting inside that cage for so long that we've forgotten how to fly?
Was the cage a prison that stopped the bird from flying, or was it a protective structure that kept the bird from flying into the sun and perishing?
That is the paradox of Shafi'i. Something for you to mull over. Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time.